Joseph share as well. So I'm going to keep it short and give it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. This is going to be a really informal workshop. In about 2 minutes, I'm going to pick up this microphone and kind of walk down there so we can all work together. But the first thing that I want to comment on when we talk about coaching is it is like many professions that we all are engaged in. There's a kind of science to coaching, but there's also sort of a kind of art form or a personal side. And I'm going to try and talk about both of those things today. So I want you to consider what's on the screen in front of you. This is a slide from a workshop that I did with Margaret Wheatley, or Meg Wheatley, who's a very well-known organizational coach and leader. Dr. Wheatley shares all of her work as open source, but does ask us to, you can see down at the bottom, Margaret Wheatley's site source, use freely. So her ideas are really essentially open source ideas that we don't have to own knowledge and science, that we can in fact pass that along to each other. She teaches some amazing week-long immersive kinds of courses, and I've been involved with Dr. Wheatley several times. We cannot change the world, the way the world is, but by opening ourselves to the world as it is. How are things, right? As it is, we may find that gentleness, decency, and bravery are available not only to us, but to all human beings. And I think in many ways that implementation science in medicine is really so much about this, right? We're trying to figure out how to close the gaps that we have because we care about each other, and we care about people, and we care about one another. So I do think that it's important when we're thinking about advancing scientific fields to try and remind ourselves of that, right? What are we doing here? What is the sort of higher purpose of all of this? And as I said, this is going to be an interactive workshop, so you will be participating. And the first way that I'm going to ask you to participate, this is also from Dr. Wheatley's work, is to think about this question: who showed up as you today? Right? Who showed up as you today? So when you're thinking about trying to be a coach, or a teacher, or a learner, or a leader in some way, right? Well, you have to figure out who you are right now in real time. So I'm not going to ask you to report this to one another, but really to perhaps, take a minute and think about these questions. Just write it down for yourselves. Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5. How present and undistracted am I? Right? It's hard to be undistracted when you have, a telephone, an iPad, people you're sitting next to, right? How present and undistracted am I? And this is really a framework for coaching, right? This is an opening exercise. How can you really launch into coaching with people? Here's a way of doing that, sort of setting the frame. This is for a person's own use. So I encourage you, take a look at the screen, write these things down, rate yourself. How open and curious do I feel? How brave do I feel? Right? In a room like this, sometimes it's really hard to ask questions because it's intimidating. Right? It's intimidating to ask people that you think are more expert. I was very impressed by the last two presenters who opened their proposals to a panel of experts. That takes some level of bravery and courage to do that. How much do I feel able to contribute to others? Right? Every day is different. And then lastly, how willing am I to support their learning as well as my own learning? So this is an essential framework for coaching. I will say there is no right or wrong answers here, right? It's just the way it is. Right, so back to that opening quote, if we think about, if we open ourselves to the world as it is in any given moment, that gives us a real platform for creating effective change. And for channeling change, so this is a workshop on how to do coaching. We often teach this workshop in about an 8 or 10 hour block. We're going to try to do this in about an hour. All right, so I encourage you to think about this as an opening exercise, and and please do rate yourself. To think about how you create learning space. So this can be an opening exercise in a meeting. It can take you 10 seconds. I'm stretching it out here to kind of explain it, but just to remind yourself and the people with whom you are working, it's okay, right? Everything's okay. Just take a baseline of where you are and what's going on for you. We've seen this a couple of times over the last few days. So interesting that virtually all of the speakers brought this to the table. This is the kind of impetus for implementation science, this knowing doing gap. It's a 17-year gap, so if you look at implementation science and you look at some of these papers and systematic reviews, these, as I have said, are 20 years old. But what has been clear for some time is that the key to successful implementation is often facilitation in one form or another. Right, so it can be very helpful to get facilitation for your implementation work. And it goes back again to this idea of accepting the world as it is. If we already knew how to do what we are trying to do, we'd be doing it. And it's really okay to accept, which is very hard for many scientists, really okay to accept the fact that we don't know how to make something happen. We're trying to make it happen, but we don't exactly know how to make that happen. So external facilitation in particular is part of successful implementation. What you can see is that the knowledge that the science to implementation gap can drop to as few as 3 years with effective use of implementation science and implementation practices. So 3 years is a lot more in real time. And I am currently working with a wonderful group of people that includes Dr. Altiz, all the people actually here on the Yale team, who have in many ways done a lot of work to shorten this gap. And in some of the work that we're doing together, we are moving knowledge into practice in real time. Right, so it can be done, and we are doing it. So coaching is a key element of implementation, and I'm going to talk and focus, and you all are going to work together today to think a bit about coaching. It's cited as the most important, or among the most important tools for successful implementation. It can take many forms, but it's most commonly organized, at least initially, as external support. What coaching is not is the imposition of a protocol, right? A protocol is a protocol, but it's not coaching. A protocol is a pathway. Learning to walk that pathway or moving onto the pathway often takes facilitation or coaching. Right? I think that this is one of the ways that we could do better when we think about how to move science to practice. Protocols often come out of, or pathways come out of, excellent research in the field, but they often are just sitting there saying this is the way. So it goes back to this idea of just letting it happen, or as opposed to actually helping it happen or creating a pathway for it to happen. So the role of a coach is varied, and we're going to talk again a bit more about that together this morning. But in the implementation, the coaches are expected to expect the goal to be met, to support the goal in being met, and rewarded for meeting the goal. So if you remember nothing about how to actually do coaching, one of the things I would ask you to think about is this idea of expected, rewarded, and supported, right? How do you communicate to people what you're actually asking them to do? What's the expectation? So if you look at the literature, around job satisfaction, for example. The most common factor when people are surveyed about their job satisfaction, the biggest predictor of job satisfaction is actually knowing what it takes to do a good job. It's that clarity of expectation. Right, so let's say for a moment you're not a scientist, you're not a researcher, you're rather a member of a practice or you're on some kind of performance or work team. How do you know if you're doing a good job? Who sets out that expectation for you? Right, so when you move into a leadership role of one kind or another, how do your colleagues know what you are expecting of them? What's it really like to do a good job? Right, so it's very important. This expected, supported, rewarded, this metric, if you will, is key to well-functioning teams and to outcomes that actually are the outcomes that you are intending to reach. Right, so first and foremost, set expectations. When we talked yesterday a bit about the NIATEX framework, we talked about that aim. Right, where are you really trying to go? That's an expectation. Okay. How do you support movement in that direction? Coaches support, the role of a coach is to support movement toward the aim, right? Movement toward the aim is supported by coaching. This is much harder than it sounds, right? Because again, we're not telling people what to do, but rather channeling for them ideas about how they are doing. Right? And if people reach those goals, how are they actually rewarded? How are teams rewarded? Do we celebrate success? Do we move on to the next 10 things? Right? So once expectations are reached, how are people made aware that excellent work has gone into reaching this expectation? And sometimes that's really all it takes. It's not necessarily about tangible or monetary rewards, but rather recognition of the fact that this journey has been undertaken. People have moved toward a goal that was set organizationally or even individually. So expected, supported, and rewarded. These are the roles of coaching. And we're going to talk through some of those roles momentarily. But first, I want to remind you that the NIATEX in and of itself is built on a framework of adult learning. Adult learning is experiential to a very large degree. It is shared, right? In medical practice, when we talk about learning, you see one, do one, teach one, right? I mean, that's kind of the metric of adult learning. So I want to ask you there at your tables, and I'm going to ask some of you again to share. Just talk with the people that you're sitting with. If you're sitting alone, if you wouldn't mind joining another group, just so we can have some conversations, that would be lovely. But when you think about coaching, what comes into your head? Spend a few minutes thinking about that. When you think about coaching, what does that mean to you before we start walking through some of this other theory and other exercises? So I'm going to give you a few minutes just to think about that. When you think about coaching, what comes in mind? So again, if you can join other people, I would really appreciate that.
Okay, so you should ask that question, but teaching is actually trying to convey the knowledge to you, right? So that's different than coaching, when we're going to work together to create an appreciation or to create a plan. That's what coaching is. They're not going to, a person who's coaching is not going to tell you what to do. They're going to encourage you about what to do and how to push you along. So that's a, for me, that's a fundamental difference. What's new? It's hard to find analogies, but I think of coaching as kind of like an exoskeleton on the guardrails. You're helping somebody actually, toward the aim without telling them how to get there. You could kind of help them. You're containing the pathway, and hopefully I'll explain that a little better as we move along. But people are still talking.
Yeah, if we can maybe go one more minute here, and if someone at your table would be willing to just kind of capture the discussion for a minute, just give us your top of mind awareness about 1 minute more to talking about what does coaching really mean to you? What comes into your head? Okay, thank you for a good discussion. I can tell people are working. I'm hoping they're talking about the question that we're that we're talking about, but even if you're not, you're communicating with each other. I've asked Ryan to just sort of maybe start there at table 14, which has a lot of the members. What did you all talk about? What does coaching mean to you?
Over to you.
Hi, what we came up with is someone who would encourage you and also give guidance in managing whatever you're doing, helping in delegating tasks as well. Someone who would keep track of progress and also have personalized plans for each person to reach a common goal.
Excellent, thank you. So a couple of key points coming out of here: encourage and guide people, and keep track of progress. Yeah. Another table, maybe table number 1 back there.
One.
Hi, so basically I think this is a very interesting question. So we were thinking like, being a coach, right, you have some big visions in your mind that we are thinking like how we actually translate in a practical way for the people who you coach, that they can see the same vision. And after that we were thinking like, sometimes they actually expect a perfect answer from you, but I think coach is someone that leads the people towards finding the right answer. Yeah, that's all.
Right, a couple of very interesting points, kind of a translation, a practice or an idea, and then a person who leads people to a particular thought or thought process as opposed to telling them. Yeah. Another table.
Table 13.
We'll go to table 13 and then number 17.
Being extorted. So I'm answering this on behalf of my onto this table on more for counseling and psychological terminology. So I'm basing this on life coaching. So it's most of a professional relationship between a client and a coach, whereby it is a personalized analysis of the person's own self-determination and self-goals, whereby the coach itself is just providing the tools, what he has experienced, he or she they has experienced, and whereby making a more personalized framework for the person to work on themselves rather than, it's self-guided, but also